Okay.
Mine is on anyway.
Right, okay, welcome everybody to this afternoon's meeting. Today the discussion about the situation in Iran, and we've got AMAN KAFA here, who's going to speak to us for about 20 minutes, and followed by a discussion. So just remind everybody, if you can just make sure you're muted when you're not speaking, so we're not getting the background noise from people's houses. Okay, thanks. Right, AMAN, do you want to make a start?
Sure. Thank you very much for today's meeting. What I wanted to mention was with really regard to the current scenario in Iran and the situation of what's happening in the country. Perhaps it may be an idea just to look at it from the point of view of the impact of the changes on one hand, and also look at it from the point of view of the situation itself and the changes which we are seeing in the country. If I just could change this, just bear with me a second, pal, so I can get my screen correctly. Sorry, just bear with me 1 second. Okay. Right, I'm just trying to see, because I see at the moment just your face. I'm just trying to get it right so I can see you. Perfect, thank you. Okay, let me start again very, very briefly. The situation that we have in Iran today is probably one that could be described best as dire in terms of the economy. The situation with regard to the problems that we have economically, on one hand, I think to some extent that is shared in many parts of the world, looking at it from the point of view of high inflation, price rises. In Iran, also addition of the devaluation of the currency over the years has meant that the price of basic goods has tremendously increased. The increase has not been in just small percentages. The high rises has meant that a large section of the society has been unable to literally keep hold of the minimum basic needs that they have. And according to the official figures, something like 60% of the population is actually going to the situation of literal dire poverty. And that is one issue that we have. The protests which have been continuing in Iran have increased. Over the past year, we have seen a much further increase in the protests in all sectors, coming out of COVID and the huge losses that we suffered in the country because the state had initially decided that there is no need of bringing vaccination from outside. They were not going to buy any vaccination from the US or other European infidels, and to a large extent that was meant that they had to wait until they could get some sort of a vaccination going on inside the country. The huge number of losses of lives forced the state finally to give in and accept some vaccination, and gradually we saw some protection with regard to the saving of lives of people. Coming out of the COVID situation and the extended pressure with regard to the standards of living, when the new president was brought in, the idea, or at least the main slogan, was that everything would be changed. There would be a huge look at the people's lives, and we saw none of that, as expected, was going to be happen. So the protests kept on continuing. The situation has reached the stage that the standards of living has meant that the actual income, and I'm talking about the average income that is considered by the official statistics, it doesn't suffice for any more than maximum 6 to 7 days of a month. And the lack of subsistence, lack of accommodation, and all of the rest, and the taking out of many of the facilities, including rising the medications, lack of available medicine, and everything else, has meant that people are actually really struggling economically. This is something which the state has been using, and there is a reason for that, and that is that pushing pressure in terms of inability to be able to maintain the minimum standards was a tool in the state's hand to suppress, literally, as a means of suppression, and forcing everybody not to actually take into any protests, because then they would be able, or if they can't get their income, that would even put more pressure on them. So it was used as a means of suppression to a large extent, and it is still being continuously used. We have that. The protests which have been taking place have spread into different areas. We are talking about all sectors. We're not just talking about industrial sections in terms of the big factories. We're talking across different sectors, petrochemical and oil, that came out about a year ago, continuation of that strike action against the use of agents along the way rather than actually being employed by one company. The protests which are taking place with regard to the situation of the teachers, that has been a very, very wide scale national protest action, which the state has not been able to stop. This has meant that the teachers are asking for increases, recognition of different structures and ranking of the teachers, and the increase of the pay. The increase of the pay and standard of living has been forming the basis of all of the major protests which have been taken across the country. We also have had literally areas where workers have not just been asking for increase in wages, but they have been asking for reversal of some of the policies of the state. For example, that of the privatization, and in some sectors, most notably in the sugarcane factory of Haftappa, we saw that they actually were able to force the state to retreat and make a U-turn and literally put the actual private owner onto the judicial system in order to literally take it out of the whole system of privatization. We've had different types of protests that have been taking place, but spread of them is one issue. Alongside this, we've had the growth in the protests, for example, among the bus drivers, and this is public transport bus drivers, going across to the nurses, different parts of the universities, from the point of view of whether the people who are academics who are teaching it to the students. We've had the situation in retired people who have been asking for an increase in the pension rises and the continuous or complete payment even of their salaries, and further and further in all the other sectors. These protests have not stopped. We're talking on average during the last year, according to official statistics, we're talking roughly about 11 industrial actions and protests taking place a day across different parts of the country. So huge amount of increase in the protest. At the same time, we have to consider one other issue, and that is, this is to some extent in terms of the pressure is probably similar to many other countries, but one thing which is different in Iran has been the extent of the protest and the direction of the protests. We have had an improvement in terms of the working people in any part forming their own general assemblies, and these general assemblies as a movement, as the basic, if you like, council or Soviet as we call it, of the people who actually make decisions. So the main slogan, or at least a very, very notable slogan across Iran now, is clearly and visibly heard to be that of the control and managing of everything through the councils directly elected by the people in every local workplace and in areas where people live. And this is a growing movement as the workers' alternative currently, which is being portrayed across the country. The growth of this as an alternative is clear. At the same time, we have the state, which is completely incapable of literally taking not only any responsibility, but being able to provide any possible hope or any light at the end of the tunnel. Therefore, the consideration that the state cannot rule is something which is clearly visible across the country as well. Furthermore, we have the, if you like, the alternative from the bourgeois or the right-wing sectors, who do not want the state of the Islamic Republic, but they've got one problem, and that is the main problem is that economically, they can't offer any alternative. They can't offer any alternative that would enhance the current state of the life of people in terms of being able to afford what they ought to be able to afford, at least as a basic minimum. And that has meant that if you like, the alternative from the working class is growing momentum largely across the country. We have had, for example, in the past 3 days, one major incident which took place in one of the cities, in the city of Abadan in south of Iran. This is one of the major oil centers. 2 huge buildings were erected. The guys who actually did do the work were the ones who had sponsored the mayor of the city and other various officials, and therefore they were allowed to build the high skyscrapers, which was not only not according to the expectations of the minimum engineering requirements, but also the savings that they made and the corruption that went through. The 2 major towers literally went down to the ground. They killed so far 29 people and 37 injured, and various other impact across even the neighboring buildings. The protests which actually started as soon as the 2 towers fell meant that the mayor who came to the city to visit the area was chased by the huge mass of protesters in the area, and they had to take him away. The special guards of the Islamic Republic, as the main guard of defense party security forces, have stormed the city. And over the past few nights, we've had street battles going on left, right, and center. At the same time, we have had, alongside this, large protests taking place across a number of cities, major cities of the country, in support of the people of Abadan and their rights to actually be saved, even from the lack of facilities that they brought to the area to save the lives of people. So that has been going on at the same time. And in addition to that, there is one thing which is clear in there, is the demand for putting all of the people who were responsible on trial. And this is what the state is trying to do, is to limit it to the one person who's actually been said, who built the building. Initially, they said that person actually died in the building under the rubble. Then they said, no, they have viewed him in Turkey. Now they say, we don't know where he is. Then there was the idea of trying to show somebody who has died as the person in charge. So therefore, there was no need for any trial. And all of this, the revelations one after the other, has meant the state has been running from one foot to the other in standing up against the protests which are taking place. We have this, but this part of it probably, you may say, seems similar to many other countries and many other protests which are taking place across different parts of the world, maybe to a larger extent. But there is one difference, I think, that we have in Iran, which is different to the other places. And the difference is not that the fact that the state is obviously responsible and lack of responsibility taken by the state is an issue, but anything which happens in Iran is considered to be the state fault. The amount of hatred of the whole apparatus is so extensive that anything that happens, doesn't matter what has happened, the blame is directly put on the shoulders, and the point is the finger is pointed at the Islamic Republic and its authorities. That's one issue which is different. The other issue which is different is, despite all the horrors, despite all of the lack of any acceptable standards, despite all of that and inability of the state, what we see is a huge, wider scale solidarity among the large sections of society. For example, when the 2 towers fell down, you saw a huge number of people coming from all the different cities with anything that they had, buckets, spades, or their dogs, to see if they can actually find anybody there to try and help, because they thought the state would not be able to actually provide their expectation. This huge solidarity, we've seen it at the time of earthquakes, time of floods, at any scenario, the huge amount of solidarity and the common cause that the state is responsible has been one factor which is, I think, to a large extent different. There is another factor which is different, is that irrespective of what the state does and all its media and everything else, they're not able to shake and put any fractures in this solidarity and this protest towards the state. The war in Ukraine happens. The Islamic Republic sided, although they said that we don't think that it's a good idea to invade any other country, but nonetheless, they have ties with Russia, and they came up effectively to a large extent in support of Russia. But even given that, didn't make any difference. The idea that they may reach some sort of a deal with the West in the nuclear talks didn't make any difference. Any action that the state does, or any major issue which we see across the world, even during the coronavirus spread, has not actually shaken that part. There is this protest is growing and growing. Alongside this, we see one thing else. Probably I better mention this as well. As this,
and you've had 15 minutes, just giving you the nudge.
As these protests are growing, and we see the growth of them, there is one thing. What are the possible choices and alternatives? Insofar as the international body, if I say the states, are concerned, there is one thing for certain, and that is they do want the Islamic Republic to stay. Despite all the rhetoric, there is no talk of regime change or anything else like that. The idea is the state of Iran is actually something which is favored, whether you're looking at it from the West or from the East, whether it is China or whether we're looking at it from Russia or whether we're looking at it from the US, Europe, etc. There is no opposition in terms of wanting to change the Islamic Republic. Pressure on Islamic Republic is something thereafter. One of the Russian ambassadors had said that we would rather to have an Iran which is suffering rather than Iran which is in the side of the US. So all of the, if you like, international community as body of the states are concerned, they do want the Islamic Republic to stay. But the pressure from under and within the society has made the situation completely different. There is no doubt that the Islamic Republic doesn't have anywhere, and therefore the downfall of the Islamic Republic is not something which is being questioned in any part of Iran, or I think internationally. They all know that it's going. The question of how it would be toppling is still an issue. As far as the working class and, if you like, the general benefit is considered from the point of view of the masses is concerned, the society polarization and continuous involvement and move towards a revolution is obviously the one that we favor. Other scenarios like creation of wars, terrorist activities, and we have seen a lot of that recently, whether it is by the state of Israel or whether it is by a variety of extreme radical nationalists, tribes or whatever, who try to actually bring in issues of weapons and arms on one hand, and trying to instigate a scenario of terror is something that the Islamic Republic favors, and obviously is something that the bourgeoisie as a whole would favor. That is their alternative, change from the top. So it is that struggle which is taking place. The situation is something that nobody knows. We could be talking now, and the day after tomorrow, the Islamic Republic may downfall. It is possible. The only thing is, anything, the situation is that volatile. Anything could be possible, and it could also be the case that the Islamic Republic stays for another year. This is not the issue of when it would occur, but the imminence of it, I think, is one thing which is very, very clear in the situation of Iran. Number two, I think the problems that we have is if there are any growth in terms of the protests from below, and if the regime does topple through the revolution, the problem is the situation across the world in order to actually seek international solidarity. And I think that is one area which needs a great change. The situation is that one of the questions is that should the working class from below, or if you like, any change towards the socialist revolution takes place, could we actually hold power? I think that is a big question. It's a practical question, and how that would be possible from the point of view of not only just the media, but from the point of view of the international support, is one thing which we are looking at very, very, I think, in detail, and is something which is crucial to understand. The other area which I think is important is differences in Iran. Probably if you go a little bit to the west, if you go to Iraq, or if you go towards Lebanon, a general population is against the state, but they are very wary of what they call parties. If you go a little bit up towards Europe or towards Eastern Europe, the word socialist or communist to a large extent is not one that you would gather a lot of favor among a lot of population. We don't have that situation in Iran. Communists, as literally communist, Bolsheviks, whatever name one may call it, but the name of general communism is something which is not at all revered, but it is something which is respected. There is no problem in terms of an idea of a socialist revolution. What the society wants is a stability, and that is what they're looking for. And if they consider that to be possible, then it is not the case of any premeditated anger towards it from within the society. We still have a lot of fight against the right wing in variety of sectors. They have access to media, they have access to huge amounts of funds and resources. Obviously, the working class doesn't have that. Insofar as the oppression is concerned, the issue of economy, as I said, as a suppressive tool, that is something which is in their hands as well. But the field or the arena is open. Our situation in terms of the working class, in terms of the level of organization, in terms of understanding what they're after, I think is a lot better than it was 2 years ago. The situation of the right wing is not any much better, simply because the whole idea of a Western alternative in itself, with its problems that it's having at the moment, from NATO or otherwise, all of them are in not a shape that could actually offer an alternative to the scenario in Iran. So from that point of view, there is a chance. What we don't see right now, at least right this minute, I don't think the situation is one of that of a socialist revolution, but an idea of a revolution is not far-fetched. I think that is definitely on the table. Alternative of socialism is something which is currently on the table. Even the monarchists, son of the old Shah, and the whole right wing that actually were gathered around him, have said that they do think, or he has said publicly, that they do think socialists do have an alternative, because they have a situation or an answer that could actually change the issue economically. And that is what the society is looking for. There is no right-wing alternative in terms of enhancement of economic conditions, whereas the left does have one. So from that point of view, recognition of that is definitely something which is widely accepted in the society and is spread. How could we improve the situation? Well, several issues. On one hand, we're still emphasizing on the issue of organization. Even in the protests that are taking place, we have called on the large sectors of known social characters within working class and across the society, people who are respected and honored because of the struggles that they have had and the participation, to come out and take hold of the situation. And what we don't want is a rebellion of the hungry. Once it becomes like that, totally unorganized, it's not something that would enhance the situation for the working class, obviously. So the protest in itself is not something which we're looking on as it is, but we're looking at what could be taken from it, how could be enhanced, and how could be developed. And this is the main arena, which is, I think, politically very, very much of the center of attention in Iran. And this is exactly what are the main areas that people are talking about. The situation of alternatives, possibility of which alternative could come and could hold power, the attempts by the extreme right, as I said, from the bombing and terroring that the Israel or other what we call dark scenarios, who really want to see a situation of mayhem. They're pursuing in terms of trying to bring the issue either of arms too quickly, to make it like Syria before people could actually be organized completely, making it into an arms struggle, or from the fact of drawing war and terror within or outside the country. That is one attempt. If the situation of the protest does grow, and it does grow further, and there is a possibility of a change through a revolution, this is something which I think would change the whole scenario. I think the attitude of the West and the East, for that matter, would change drastically in terms of what they would push forward. Last time we were unsuccessful in 1979, people went out and there was mass protest. As the process started to grow, suddenly the Islamic Republic was brought upon us, and that was well accepted and was pushed through. This time, there is one thing certain: there is no alternative in Iran which would be accepted by anything which is non-republic, by anything which is in any way religious, by anything which doesn't actually recognize the rights of people from the point of view of equality of women and men. And there is one thing for certain, and that is, given the whole media and the level of technology today, there is no such thing that would accept anything less than the minimum standards which is expected in a European country. Those are issues which the right wing cannot give, and that's in favor of us. The question
20
is,
minutes now, man, just remind you. Yeah.
So the question literally is how much this organization that we are working with, and I mean we as not just one party, but I mean as the section of the working class that does want to have a socialist revolution, the extent that we can organize and the speed which we can organize it in order to actually be ready as the upheaval take place. These are the main issues which I think are on the agenda, and these are the main issues which could make a difference. In terms of the arrest and suppression, I think they are common knowledge now, and this is something that we have been facing all the time. Maybe the only difference is that the Islamic Republic nowadays does not have neither the ability nor the, if you like, the stamina to be able to enforce anything other than fighting for life. We saw it in the last protest, which took place about 2 years ago, just before Corona, that they went for a shoot to kill on the street. Now, this policy has been tried in a couple of cities, but the Islamic Republic is very, very fearful of continuation of any policy like this because the repercussions are not clear at all. And this is one thing which has meant that even people who have been arrested, and they are snatching and arresting people left, right, and center, but holding them in prisons, not doing anything about it, is something which is pushing more and more towards their release, and they have had to release some people recently as well. So the struggle goes on, the protests are growing, alternatives are becoming more and more, higher and deeper polarization in the society, and a chance for the working class in their move towards a socialist revolution, though it may happen through several revolutions rather than just one. Thanks, Pam. I tried to wrap it up.
That's great. That's a really, really good and clear and comprehensive report. Thanks very much for that. Extremely interesting and obviously full of potential. Right, who would like to speak first or ask any questions? Steve.
Yeah, thanks for the report. I was wondering, what is the situation of the left, revolutionary left in Iran? How are they organized? Who do they represent? Do they represent unions or workers? What's going on with the organized working class and the left? And also the relationship of Iranian workers to workers in the United States around the world. I know that there's a solidarity campaign for the teachers who've been jailed to release them, and transit workers, and we're interested in supporting that in the United States and San Francisco. So what does that have any effect, and international solidarity, and how do you see building an international campaign in the working class, global working class for Iranian workers? Thanks.
Steve, Matthew.
Yeah, hi, comrades. Thanks. Very useful and interesting, and I think almost an awesome presentation. I think I would echo Steve in saying that what is the state of the left in Iran? I mean, obviously it has one of the best histories in terms of a penetration historically of Trotskyism into Iran, but it'd be interesting to know exactly, I mean, obviously to as far as can be discussed openly in terms of the organization. And also, of course, the impact on on other countries. I mean, clearly you're going to see a whole series of other countries in the area, Iraq for a start, which is also in a state of near collapse. And whose politics is now obviously seriously linked to that of Iran. And Lebanon and so on. How does that how does that situation impact in terms of Iran and internationally? Plus, of course, obviously the disintegration or and destruction of Afghanistan. I mean, I believe there's 2 million Afghan refugees or something like that order in Iran, and probably more to come. So, I mean, it's not obviously in regional terms. What is the impact as well? Because clearly it goes well beyond the borders of Iran. Thanks.
Matthew, there's no other hands up at the moment, so perhaps Aman, you'd like to respond while people think. That's okay. You're muted though, you need to unmute yourself.
Now, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, yeah.
Okay, let me say one thing. Insofar as the left and the situation of the left is concerned, when I said communist, to a large extent, the tradition of communism from the point of view of Bolshevism and Marxism, that's what I meant by communism. In Iran, nobody talks about the people who are, let's say, pro-Russia or pro-China or anything else like that. They're not known as communists. They have their own names, and they have shown it over the past in terms of how they side with the state to a large extent. So it really means that in that part. Insofar as the situation, before I go to the left, probably have to say something about the working class. In Iran, the right of workers to organization is not allowed legally. What the state has got is a certain, what they call trade organizations. They allow it to some extent. There are officially something like a handful of what is known as syndicates in terms of places that were initially in Haftarpur as a sugarcane factory. There is one with regard to bus workers, and there is that of the teachers. There is one or two small ones, but they're very, very small. The movement that we're seeing, the rest of it is in a situation where organization is not allowed. It literally is not allowed. The inability to organize, or the right of organization, is not just with regard to the left and the working class, but across the country. The right wing, even those parts of the Islamic Republic, they have their own organizations internally, but there is no right as such. So the working class does not have major trade unions. So that's why when we talk about general assemblies and the mass of workers working together, that's literally the way that they actually form and they express their opinion as a body. And it has two benefits. On one hand, it actually brings the whole masses of people, so therefore everyone is involved. Secondly, suppression of it is a lot more difficult. Thirdly, they can't handpick several people as the representatives. So that's why that movement has grown. And the tradition of what we call as councils or general assemblies in Iran, they refer to it as the word shura, which means the same as council or Soviets. That's the tradition which is very, very strong in Iran. In terms of the formation of those in different workplaces, it's becoming more and more the norm. Recognition that industrial action does not take place because somebody somewhere says something is more the case because these groups, or if you like, large assemblies, are formed and people actually take part in this. through the industrial action. So it represents large sectors. In terms of the situation of the left itself, we have different types. Obviously, we have the traditional, and I think middle class left, and we have the communists, as in terms of what I refer to as the communism within working class, what Marx used to refer as the communism coming as part of the working class. From that point of view, that is very strong, and it's not just among different parts of the country. It is something which is, as I said, have a respectable name. Nobody refers to them as something which has been there somewhere else, but it's more the case of something which is new, something which doesn't accept all of the powers, the groups that do not want to follow the path of peasants to the towns of Mao, or that of the era of Stalin onwards in Russia. So that is a strong tradition, and that has got a base in Iran. And this is something which is different, as I said, in Iran compared to the other countries in the region. There is another thing which is different, and that is unlike what happened in Lebanon, or unlike what happened in Iraq, or to a large extent even in Tunisia and even Egypt, in Iran, the idea that the Islamic Republic has been brought in, not because masses actually brought it in, but because it was agreed as partly with regard to the, at the time, decision of the West, and then following by the support of Russia, is well known in the country. So it is not the case that people saying, okay, there should be a regime change and therefore a change would be acceptable. The idea that the Islamic Republic has been in place to a large extent was to show that unlike countries like Afghanistan, unlike countries like, for example, Iraq, etc., or Syria, they are there to bring stability. Whereas the current situations over the past 4 decades has shown Iran has always been lacking that stability. And the idea of an alternative is something which is very much favored. So these make it slightly different to the other places. One other issue which I think probably is also important is the issue that of the solidarity against the Islamic Republic. That is much across the whole fabric of the society. Iran was the only country in the Middle East who went through a revolution, not in 1979, but much before that. We had one revolution which recognized the right of individual. Now that has got deep roots. For example, if you consider places like Iraq, Turkey, for a large example, hasn't had that. None of the countries in Middle East have had that. The respect of the individual that doesn't accept the push of the authorities just because authorities are there is something which is deeply born in the country. Two, during the Shah's time, Iran was very much linked to the West in general. So the society was very much more of a modern society by the standards of the time. And even despite 4 decades of the Islamic Republic, still today they can't enforce the veil on women. Whereas that is not the situation that you see, for example, in Saudi Arabia, or the role and the power that some of the Islamic groups have across Middle East. That is not the case in Iran. It's impossible for the Iranian society to accept anything which even bears the name Islamic. That is one thing which is definitely in the society. If you talk to anyone in Iran today, they will say, there are minimums we want. We want to be able to do what we want. And the youth, to a large extent, does not accept anything other than the basic rights that you would expect to see if you're living in Europe. 3, the recognition of the right of women. The society does not consider women as second or third class citizens. It's very much the state which is trying to enforce it, and they haven't been able to enforce it. The current protests that are taking place, you see the women in there. The role of women and presence of women is something that nobody can deny. It's impossible for any state that it is not secular. It is impossible for any state that does not recognize the equality among the individuals in terms of gender or even sexual orientation. The society does not accept any of the pressures that you would see in many parts of the Middle East in the society itself. That would not be acceptable. And this is the situation that makes it different in terms of the alternatives in Iran. it's impossible for another one similar. That's why the Islamic Republic, even to stay in power or come to power, it needed a huge amount, and I mean 6-some figures of deaths and executions before they could actually do enforce themselves. So that is one thing which is in that society, which is different. In terms of the propaganda of the state, obviously the state trying to say that Iranian society is better or different to the other ones, and everybody else outside there is wrong. Insofar as the society is concerned, even we saw it 2 years ago in mass demonstrations. The Islamic Republic tried to put the US flag on the roads, hoping that people would cross over it to stamp the American flag, and everybody just walked around it. There is nothing in society which says we are against this or that country. That doesn't exist in Iran. The state does push it, but that is not acceptable. The other issue, which I tried to mention earlier in terms of solidarity, you can see it in different areas. Soon as Taliban came into force and came into power in Afghanistan, there was a huge outcry within Afghanistan, and people wanted to leave Afghanistan. The state went in Iran and said, we are going to enforce the borders to ensure that we don't have any more illegal immigrants, given that there are 2 million Afghans in Iran. The state did run, like before, a program of trying to say the problem is that these Afghan workers are either unable, they are not civilized. As an Afghan worker, by the way, if you do marry an Iranian woman, let's say a male Afghan man, and does marry an Iranian woman, the children cannot have birth certificate. The children cannot go to school. So there is that which the Islamic Republic has been pushing. But soon as Taliban came into power, immediately across the whole society of Iran, the level of solidarity with women in Afghanistan was so high that large sections of society, some went to the borders, and they all had social media was full of it, that everybody was saying, this is my address. Any Afghani family who wants to come to Iran, you're welcome, come into my house. That level of solidarity is very different to what the state tries to portray. So there is that thing which I think in the basis of society, and that is because of the protests and struggles which have been taking place in Iran. It's not something that the state can overcome. It's woven within the fabric of society. And given the fact that I said that if you think about it, if somebody wanted to actually stop working for 4 days, the state had to show in the falling down of the tower in the city of Abadan, even the state itself on its broadcasting TV went in to talk to some of the people, and the people who were there, they were saying, I've taken 3 days off work. Somebody said, I've managed to take 2 days off work. We just got to a family, we came together, came down here to see what help we can provide. That level of solidarity, I think, is unique. It only happens at the time when people have got the common agenda. That's the only time it would happen. And that common agenda is very much evident, I think, across Iran. Does this mean that we have got an easy ride? The answer is no. I think if anyone thought that the left, the working class, would be able to actually just simply go and take the power, it is totally mistaken, as I'm sure all of you would agree. The bourgeoisie does have a lot in its hand. There are right-wing alternatives. And at the moment, as I said, there is no other state who want the Islamic Republic to go. Should the situation change further and the fear of left or working class advances come much more clear, the situation could change. And how prepared we are for that, these are the plans that we have to think right now. What happens if people start to move around and they decide to go and get a couple of areas where the guns are kept? What do we do when it is the case that they actually storm this or that building and they take over it? How do we make sure mayhem and chaos does not prevail? This is what the right wing wants. Either state change from the top, that's one way they can get to power, or mayhem. These are the two ways that they bourgeoisie can actually find some way to power. If it's given to a free election I think they all know that they don't have a chance. The problem is that they don't want to wait for that situation to occur. That is the situation we had. Over the past 3 years, we had times where tribal groups were formed, partially even funded by Saudi Arabia, partially by Israel, partially by the West, same as what we saw with ISIS. A variety of these groups have tried to be formed, but the Islamic Republic managed to overcome those. Today, if the situation of mayhem does become the case, they all are players, and they will do everything, same as the Islamic Republic does, in order to create fractions within the mass movement that is taking place. I hope that answered the question.
Thanks very much, Aman. No other hands up? Anybody else want to ask a question, say anything? Roger.
I'd like to ask some questions.
Right. Can I take Jimmy first and then renew Roger? Is that okay?
Yeah, I was going to say Jimmy was first.
Oh, was he? I didn't see his hand go up though. Jimmy, are you using your electronic hand? Because if you don't put your
can't find it. It's not on the screen.
Then. I'll watch out for you in future. Okay, off you go.
The question I wanted to ask is quite a specific one. It's in relation to the Revolutionary Guards. Last week, there was a fairly highly profiled report of the assassination of a member of the Revolutionary Guards. And what struck me was it appeared to be a single assassination of an individual, yet it seemed to have an impact far more, or a content far more than what was showing. That why would the killing of one individual have such a high profile concern nationally, but equally internationally? And the questions I wanted to ask in relation to the Revolutionary Guards, first of all, my understanding is that the Revolutionary Guards developed 40 years ago or more out of the activists around the religious organizations that came to power. But 40 years is a long time in the life of a military force, and those younger people have probably been replaced by new generations. And I'm curious as to where those generations come from. Are the Revolutionary Guards an elite organization, such as, say, the SAS or the SEALs or the Rangers of the other conventional armies, where they select individuals based on their skills and their application and groom them as a special organization? Or is it an organization that is composed somewhat like some of the fascist organizations of lumpens and thugs, just hooligans put in uniform? And I'm trying to understand what the career prospects are within the Revolutionary Guards.
Jimmy's frozen up. Just give him a few seconds to see if he comes back. No, we've lost. He's still there. You're muted now, Jimmy. Jimmy, we can't hear you music.
Yeah. Okay, I'm back again. Now, what I was asking there is, like, what are the career prospects within the Revolutionary Guards, and how do they maintain their stability? The question also is the relationship of the Revolutionary Guards with the regular army. And are the regular army, who is a skilled workforce in the machine and system of killing and controlling, are they composed of conscripts or volunteers? And if they are conscript, does the conscript scheme apply to women as well? Or in terms of the pool of people that they draw from, are they drawn from working class areas, from rural areas, or are there exemptions for the middle classes? And again, what are the career prospects within the army? If, for example, there was an alienation of the Revolutionary Guards, could the civilian, civilian is not the word I'm looking for, but the more secular army, could that exist and play any role in stabilizing a state, either for the right or for some sort of democratic movement? Really,
I've really lost him this time.
I don't know where I was cut off there, but like,
Only
it's more or
briefly.
less a summary of the questions there is like the construct and future for the Revolutionary Guards, their importance and the role of whether or not the regime could survive without them.
Okay, thanks, Jimmy. Roger, you're next.
Yeah, well, I was going to say how really elated and enthused I was by Aman's contribution. And he reminded us of some very, very positive factors about the consciousness of the Iranian working class compared to others in the region or maybe in the world. But I think he also quite rightly tempered that or moderated that in his last comments and gave us, sobered us down a little bit. But nevertheless, I mean, we do have to remember, as he reminded us, that there's been the Iranian working class has gone through two revolutions. In the 1950s, a quite major uprising, which was brutally put down by imperialist intervention, and then, of course, the revolution of 1979, which was, if you like, derailed by the Islamic counter-revolution. But also, I think the last time that Aman spoke to a WIN meeting on Iran, was it in, I think, 2019? Or at that time, he showed us a huge growing strike movement as well. And remember that Iran has quite a strong industrial working class. And again, that marks it out from many other countries in the region. I was interested to note also that the revolt is not only on the question, on the very real issue of hunger and poverty and deprivation, but as he indicated, also by issues of the infrastructure. He talked about the collapse of the buildings in Abadan, which reminded me, in a way, of the revolutionary situation which developed in Lebanon a year or two ago, with the explosion in the Dockland area, and also, although it was on a much more limited, minor geographical scale, but the Grenfell disaster in Britain in 2017, which on a local scale, I think also could be said to have aroused what you could almost say a revolutionary mood, a mood of absolute determination to overthrow the rotten structure of the state. And what was very interesting about Aman's contribution as well is that universal hatred of the state machine that he that he indicated. Also, the converse of that, if you like, the flip side of that, the way that the regime, I can't remember quite how he put it, but the regime lacks stamina, or lacks the resolve for, is actually getting demoralized itself by its failure to cope with the multiple problems in Iranian society. Also, the fact that he not mentioned, but emphasized the growth of these councils, which, as Aman said, they are in effect Soviets. They may not have conscious leadership, which is aspiring towards taking over state power, but they're Soviets in the sense that they're organizations of working people in their places of employment and in their in their living estates and so on. And that's also a very, very positive factor. I want to ask also, though, about some possible pitfalls. First of all, I remember a few years ago, there was a big youth revolt in Iran, and it was presented in the West. And I'd like really to know Aman's comments on this. It was presented as a sort of pro-Western aspirations of youth, that they just wanted the freedom, the social freedoms, and the liberation from the kind of religious oppression that they were facing. Are there still, or were there then even, illusions in Western society among the youth, maybe among the students or more middle class youth? Also, I know it's now over 4 decades since the movement that overthrew the Shah, but at that time, the Tudeh party had a strong base, the Communist Party. What is there anything left of that now? And also, one other question related to that, the Mujahideen, which also played a big role in the revolution and in the aftermath of the revolution, and then in resistance to the Islamic regime. Do they still exist? Do they have any influence? In other words, are there any possible deviations which could sidetrack a movement of revolution? Overall, a very, very encouraging report from Aman, but I would be interested to know a little more about those questions.
Okay, thanks, Roger. Moving on to John or Dominic.
Yeah, it's Dominic. It's just a very brief question, but these committees of action, or whatever title you put on them, are they coming together? Are they joining up? Are they cooperating across different areas? Is that possible in the circumstances in Iran? You know, it's a question of what can be built on a national scale as far as those committees are concerned, because I think you can have committees all over the place, but unless they start coming together, you know, and getting the class together as a group, it's going to be a major pitfall there, because they'll get picked off one at a time, and all the dangers of that of you know, infighting, sectarianism have been spread by the ruling class and its agents. So I just wanted to know what moves were being made, or what people were, you know, people like yourself are pushing for as far as cooperation and spreading that idea about.
Okay, thanks very much, Dominic. Right, in the absence of any hands up at this moment in time, Aman, would you like to respond to all those questions?
Yeah, yes, sure. Let me try and I'm hoping I haven't missed anything. If I had, do let me know. Let me just clear a couple of small points. In something like 115 years ago, we had a constitutional revolution. That's the one I was referring to. That constitutional revolution was the only one that happened, and the whole idea was that we can't have absolute rule as a dictatorship of a given individual, and the situation led to the monarchy, which came in Iran afterwards. Literally, the remnants of that meant that the individuals had the right, and there should be ability to choose in terms of representatives, etc. Then we've had the major uprising that was taking place, and that was the one that a military coup took place and Shah was brought back in. Then we had the 1979 uprising, and it's just interesting, just to give you a picture. In 1979, when the uprising took place, initially, when what we call, let's just call them as general mass left, that was protesting, and that was coming from the working class to a large extent in terms of the protests, as they were taking place, initially the slogan of "Down with the Shah" was considered to be that of the left. When the Islamic Republic and Ayatollah Khomeini at the time came in, the Islamic alternative, which was being formed to be coming in place, their idea was that anybody that was shouting "Down with the Shah" and anybody repeating it, they used to take them out of the demonstrations, they used to put them out, because they were said they are the subversives and these are the left people, they're trying to divert the whole uprising. And the whole idea of bringing the Islamic Republic and the Green Belt, if you like, in front of what they called Russians, if you like, Red Belt, was to actually ensure that the working class in Iran does not try to ask any further. When I said that the society did not want the Islamic Republic, but it was brought upon it, and enforcing of Islamic laws is something that they have had to enforce over 4 decades, and they still can't enforce it, is something because that was against the whole movement that was taking place, not just then, but since then as well. 2, the population in 1979 was 35 million. The population of Iran today is 80 million. So over 4 decades, we've had a 50 million, 45 million rise in population. And therefore, you can assume from that point of view, the huge amount of considerably what we call youth in the society. Now, this youth, to a large extent, is the youth that has come, and over the past 20, 30 years of it, has been looking at the internet. This is the youth that has come from a society that did have a lot of modernism, right down until today, and it recognized liberal values of what we see in the left. I think when Roger did mention about the illusion about the Western society, I'm just trying to say which part of West I was referring to. It wasn't the case that they were looking for parliament or things like that, but recognition of the rights. You can dress as you wish. You can have any sexual orientation as you want. You should be able to study what you wish. It's not the case that because of Islamic laws, women cannot, for example, study law or cannot be a judge. It's not acceptable. Everybody's supposed to work. Everybody's supposed to actually be able, through the work, get their pay, and then through their pay, they can do whatever they want. This kind of recognition of Darwinism, if you like to think about it, if you like to think about the liberal values from that point of view, that has been fought over and gained across the West, those are very much the same thing that they would expect. Freedom of you being able to express what you want, freedom of press, etc. These are very much within the fabric society that cannot be shaken. The Islamic Republic cannot shake those. That's why they have to have special forces going along within the society to try and actually enforce it. Another issue you mentioned, like Tudeh Party. Tudeh Party means the People's Party, which is the pro-Moscow party that was in Iran. They worked with the Islamic Republic. They were part of the grouping that actually was in charge, and they actually arrest, apprehensions, imprisonment, etc., until the time that the Islamic Republic cleared itself a little more and purified itself more and threw them out, and they became opposition again. So to a large extent, they are not what in Iran, if you go today and say communist, apart from the state itself, nobody calls the Tudeh Party, or if you like, those pro-Russian Stalinist parties, they don't call any of them communists. They're not recognized as part of the left. They exist now. They have been for the past few years considering themselves as opposition and left opposition. But in terms of the general society, that is not what is referred to them. Mujahideen have been effectively, these are the Islamic alternatives. They work with the Islamic Republic. They went and worked with the first president of the Islamic Republic. Then again, when there was a clarification and, if you like, cleansing of internal parts of the Islamic Republic, the first president left Iran, fled Iran, so did Mujahideen. Mujahideen is a party which is very much recognized as a party of what we call a dark scenario. They have got a backing, and they're like a sect. From US, Pompeo went to meet them just recently. They are given resources. They used as a thorn of putting pressure on the Islamic Republic hugely from the point of view of the West, and especially the US. They don't have a following in Iran. They are part of the work that have been working. They are known as the part of subversive, and they're known as if you like, a sect, an agent from outside. So they don't have any social power. That's why if there is mayhem, non-social powers with resources and guns, etc., could have a say in the country. The other question that was mentioned about the issues of the Revolutionary Guards, I think was asked earlier. There is one thing. The Revolutionary Guards were formed at the time by the Islamic Party and Islamic State in order to ensure that they can actually hold on to the power. There is one thing which has happened, and this Revolutionary Guard is no longer just a security force. Revolutionary Guards are an institution. They're one of the biggest institutions economically in the country. They hold huge amounts of economic power, and therefore they do have a lot of say. The few years ago, even, for example, I don't know if any of you remember President Ahmadinejad, who was the first one who went to UN and said that Israel should be annihilated. He was one of the major representatives that was brought by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards as the candidate. That was the main candidates at the time. They are not a special group. They are an economic institution, and they do have arms. Effectively, they're there as a defense force, as a security force, but do recognize them that it's not just the force. It has huge amounts of power economically within the country, with banks, with a huge amount of investments. For example, the whole mobile network in Iran, which is one of the biggest ones in the whole Middle East, is controlled by them. It is part of their ownership. And there are many, many other areas which is in their control. So they're not just a special armed force as a SEAL group. There are special forces, special guards forces, like the one I mentioned who have come to the city of Abadan. They are specific. The rest of the body of the Revolution Guard is part of security forces, and they do have huge amount of, as I said, economic and political power as well. They are power brokers, and they make decisions in the country. So when we say they are actually coming in, yet there are some people who get paid and go to work in there. Their work is not just in like an army. They do have a huge amount of institutions, so people actually do work for them. So there is a career in that respect. The army is still there. Army is separate. The role of the places like Revolutionary Guards, they are partly internal, but part of them is supposed to work externally. It was this Revolutionary Guard section, the external force of it, which they call the Quds army. This was the force that went to Syria and had been fighting ISIS in Syria. That's the same force which has a lot of role in Lebanon and the rest of the Middle East. This part of the Revolutionary Guard, who's one of the main generals, was Qasem Soleimani, who was killed by the US forces about 3 years ago roughly now. This part of the Revolutionary Guard, it was one of the colonels that had come to Iran for a break from Syria, and he was killed at his house. The fact that he had come to Iran and people did know when he would be coming for his holiday, the fact that they did know when he would be on his own, this meant internal intelligence sources. And everybody knows the finger is pointing at Israel. Israel has been chasing him, and Israel, everybody says, did assassinate him. Now, in repercussion to that, there have been several killings in Israel recently in the past week. The Islamic Republic has not claimed that they have done it, but they do say that they enjoy the events that have taken place. So in other words, there is a tit for tat. This is what I said, which is one of the major areas of danger for us, that the role that Israel could play and the role that the Islamic Republic could play in enforcing and extending terrorizing as a means of opposition to what is happening in Iran. That is in the background as well. That is one area which we try to in any way go against. We condemned both the actions of the Islamic Republic in terrorizing outside, same as we condemned the actions of Israel within Iran, same as we condemned the action of US going to Pakistan and killing one of the heads of the ISIS. it seems that it's completely open, that they have got the right, these countries, or these states rather, to actually carry out any action they want to, anywhere they want to. And this is something which there is no support for. Having said that, everybody likes to have an idea that one of the other major colonels of the Revolution Guard has been killed. One less devil on the world, in a way. That's what the saying goes in Iran. Nobody is mourning his loss, but at the same time, the way that this terrorization, if that continues, would actually act against the whole society and the working class movement is definitely something which is on the agenda. There was one other question about this councils that they are forming. What we have done to a large extent is we've said what is the minimum that could be acceptable in Iran as an alternative to the Islamic Republic. And when I say what is the minimum, it doesn't mean that this is what we fight for, but we're saying what does the current movement definitely wants and would not accept any less. And that is the rule by the councils of people. Councils that are elected within every workplace, within every living area, in every borough, and these work together in order to actually constitute the alternative. So therefore, no armed forces, no professional armed forces, complete ability of openness of people to actually decide their decisions. And this is what we're trying to actually push on the right wing as well. Irrespective of what comes into power, it should be the case that these councils should be able to make the decision, and these councils, whatever verdict they have, should be something that, if they do make decisions, should be what can be carried out through. And therefore, that is one thing which is, I think, the minimum which would be accepted. And I think that will provide the best scenario for further advancement and a socialist revolution, should that not happen through one revolution, but through multiples of revolutions. And I think permanent from that point of view is something which is definitely, in terms of extensive class struggle within Iran, would take place with the fall of the Islamic Republic rather than during the fall. That's most likely scenario. Whether the world turns out like that or not, I'm not sure, but I think that is most likely scenario, that once the Islamic Republic falls, then the class struggle would accentuate very much more and deepens very much more. One very last question was, could the Soviets be brought together? Well, that's what we're fighting for. Is it possible to do it? At the moment, there are a huge number, well, put it this way, in terms of these struggles taking place, it's impossible to deny one thing. There are a huge amount of interconnections across the working class throughout the society. Whether these have come into the meaning that these councils, the local ones, have they got a national body? The answer is no, not yet. At the moment, I think this is not something which we are seeing. I think it would most likely happen with the fall of the Islamic Republic rather than prior to that. At the moment, that is not possible. There are lots of links and interlinks. What we want to see is not just their connection, but their organic connection, being able to make decisions. We don't have it nationally at the moment. The only sector which has a national connection as a body is that of the teachers at the moment. This is because they had it as a trade within the law. They are the only ones who have that national body. The other thing that has happened over the 40 years, and the Islamic Republic has done a huge amount of work on that, is that they have actually worked on fragmentation of working class in any sector, in almost every sector, even oil. You could be working with 200 other people, but it's not the case that you're all employed by the same employer. There are different agents, different sections, and this is one way of fragmenting it. And the way they have done it is that everybody is actually, every small sector is owned and or run by a separate body. That has been happening. The only one, as I said, that they haven't done it, or they haven't been able to do it, and remained as a national one, is that of the teachers. Everywhere else, we are working on the linking and moving out of this scenario. And the advantage of the councils is that they don't limit themselves to a trade. So therefore, it is not possible to actually have one trade and another trade and another trade next to it. it automatically brings the workers together. But bringing them to a national level is one thing we are working towards. But at the moment, no, there isn't a national one. But there are links in terms of, you see, somewhere actually takes an industrial action, then somewhere else takes an industrial action for the same demands. That's when I said the organic one underneath is there, but as a national body, no, there isn't.
Thanks very much, Aman. I don't see any of the hands up at the moment. We've still got quite a bit of time left. If anybody would like to ask something else, or somebody that spoke would like to ask something again, say something again.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
All right, let's just pose this as a question. And I think this is a question which is not for us to only consider, and I think this is for socialists everywhere to consider. If there is an uprising in Iran, and not unlikely this uprising does lead to not necessarily anything, but it's in a process of making, if the left does have a chance, the question is, how could we actually ensure, and I think this is one of the countries closest to this uprising with this kind of direction. If that is the case, how prepared are we socialists across the world to come in support? Is it possible, for example, like last time, I know that they can't bring an Islamic Republic, but when it happens, and I think that puts on our agenda a few things internationally, and I don't mean it right now as an answer, but I mean, when there is an uprising, if there is any kind of workers' alternatives, the whole world would come on them like a ton of bricks. There are things that we have to do in order to ensure that the working class across the world sees this is different. Openness, obviously, and a variety of other things, and improvement economically, so people can actually see it and benefit from it. But I think it puts a huge amount of emphasis on not only our ability from Iran and outside Iran, but I think it brings issues to the point to bear in mind, what would the working class do across the world in its support? I don't mean us as individuals, but I mean how, or perhaps I'm emphasizing part of the winning here, how could we ensure that it is not possible to bomb it out? How do we ensure that they don't enforce another war on it? How do we ensure that they don't put this economic embargo like what they're doing in Russia today, or in Iran today, or on other countries today? That economic embargo doesn't become a case that cannot be broken. These are questions, we see them to some extent imminent. And obviously there are theoretical questions which obviously we have to think about probably afterwards to answer. If the workers do manage to go further, if they do have a socialist revolution in Iran, what would the rest of the working class do?
Thanks, Aman. I mean, that is a very pertinent question. Would anybody like to attempt to answer that or suggest what might happen?
That's the question we all want to know in relation to our own struggles.
Would anybody like to put it? Oh, Dominic is right. Dominic, as a suggestion.
I mean, I think all that can be done in countries abroad, it's the first thing is to publicise what is going on, explain the struggle, that it's a class struggle, and bring that to the movement in every way we can, whether it's in the workplace, among the youth, anywhere else, because it's that mass building, sort of mass support is the only that you're going to get. You know, having formal relationships with the trade union movement or something and getting the TUC to pass a resolution, in my opinion, is absolutely meaningless. It's a question of the rank and file putting the pressure on the TUC and telling them they've got to do it. Not that they, you know, pass some resolution which some later on they're going to renege on. And it's a question of raising it, that this is the workers' struggle. We're part of it. We're part of the same oppression that these people are feeling. And I think in the period that's coming, because this inflation that's going on in the West and across the world and all the rest of it with the attacks on the working class, is either going to build chaos or it's going to build solidarity among the working class. And as far as I see it, socialist role is to build that solidarity everywhere we can. So it's not a solution in a sense, but it's an approach, I think, that it's sort of ABC, and I'm sure everybody else would say the same.
Thanks, Dominic. Matthew?
Could I just come in on, behind Dominic? First of all, I want to apologise for dropping out there at a complete power failure. So I don't know whether...
Well, it was Matthew, but if you feel you need to come in now, Jimmy, then go ahead.
Sorry?
I said Matthew. Well, I think Matthew was next, but you go ahead. I'm sure Matthew won't mind waiting a minute.
Okay, yeah, I'm at a disadvantage there without that hand signal. The point that Dominic was making there in relation to the role of the bureaucracy, the role of the official institutions, I would agree with that. And if we take a look at the situation in Belarus and Ukraine, where there's crisis for workers in both states, yet the officials, the official leaderships have been absolutely mute in terms of the role of Lukashenko and his creatures, compared with what they're doing in Ukraine. But yet what they're doing in Ukraine appears to be echoing and following the capitalist states rather than taking independent action. But on the ground, workers internationally, even simple things like offering the collections, waving Ukraine flags, expressions of sympathy, but they're also been translated into action in fundraising and sending food and sending money and sending resources, and in some cases sending volunteers to Ukraine. And I would imagine that there would be a similar situation in Iran, that it would very much depend on individuals. It would very much depend on rank and file organizations and popular support rather than the institutional support of either state or the bureaucracies of labor. And I feel that would be something we just have to live with, that there'll be a certain echo across the generations of Spain, where everybody appeared to sympathize with the Spanish Republic, but it was only the workers on the ground who either joined or supported, and the official states bonded with the fascist state either by supporting or by ignoring, which is just as bad. And I think the same thing would probably be the same expectation from the states internationally in Iran. There would, I would expect, be a certain amount of mischief making, because the Islamists have little or no support anywhere, institutionally or sympathetically, outside of their own small coterie and a few other sympathizing regimes. There would be total rejection of any support. And I think there would be an expression of delight, the same way there was when the Taliban went down the first time. And the Taliban at this stage is probably the worst advertisement that an Islamic state could have, because particularly in relation to the role of women. But the bottom line would be, it would still come back to the workers for support rather than the institutions.
Okay, thanks, Jimmy. Matthew, sorry to ask you to wait. Would you like to come in now?
Yeah, I think it would be more, any response to something which openly socialist, an openly socialist revolt in a country will be much more profound. I mean, we have to look back to the response to the Russian Revolution and say, okay, well, we've also got a situation in which clearly, things have got worse. I mean, we've got a decay. I mean, it's quite naked now, a decay of society and capitalism, and there is clearly for most people no obvious alternative, and under conditions also in which all of the workers' organisations which have gone before have discredited themselves. I mean, we can look, at the point of Russian Revolution, obviously you still had mass social democracy, which was relatively recent, had some credibility, was still strong in the unions, had people who'd been involved in mass struggle, etc. All of that's gone. I mean, these things have gone. and rightly too. But the point would be, you know, what was the form of the appeal? But I mean, any such thing would have a really profound effect on politics, and obviously would meet with, you know, probably incredible savagery from the imperialists, you know, because obviously there would have been the level of fear. I mean, you can see, you know, imperialism clearly understands that it's in a fragile situation, just to put it mildly, in terms of the fact, you know, obviously that it doesn't have, you know, there's a mass of people generally are disaffected, and any such movement could clearly easily, you know, summon up the best of the society. You know, the question is how is it put, and what forces, etc. But I think that in those terms, we have to look at it and say, look, any such thing happen anywhere in the world would have a profound effect, and really it would be on the scale of what happened after the Russian Revolution, and to a degree, it is say even deeper than that, because of the absence of any alternative within the working class, you know, at this point. I mean, to say there's obviously enormous issues and problems, and not least the fact that the imperialists are armed to the teeth and are quite happy to kill millions, you know, tens of millions, with you know, no compunction whatsoever. Clearly, they've done it, and they'll carry on doing it.
No, sorry, thanks for that, Matthew. Okay, or anybody else, or shall we return to Aman for some? We've got a few more minutes left. Oh, Roger, do you want to come in now?
Well, I'd just add, and obviously I agree with Matthew, and of course, the world is so much more integrated now, but also the struggles. There's never been a time, we say this at every meeting more or less, there's never been a time when there's been such a worldwide upsurge of struggle. It would be easier to list the number of countries in the world where there was not an uprising taking place or not been in the recent period than to list the ones where there are. So, I mean, I think there would be an enormous wave of solidarity and sympathy with any struggle of workers. But at the same time, I mean, this is something which, you know, we almost take that implicitly for granted, that that our struggle is not just a national struggle, and that the links to the working class internationally, despite the fact that the working class, of course, is not the same as it was in 1917. The center of gravity of the working class has shifted to other continents and so on. The industrial working class is far weaker as a proportion of society in the Western European countries and so on. But nevertheless, I mean, there's overall the balance of forces is overwhelmingly in swinging towards the solidarity of the working class and the integration of the working class through, of course, also through all the technological means they have of communication, of the internet and all the other links and connections that there are. But in the end, there's no answer. We can't say. There is no guarantee. But each of us has to do what we can, and let's see.
Okay. Anybody else? People are putting comments up in the chat. Maybe they would like to say something. I'm not sure in David's case. No? Okay, there's no more hands going up. I'm going to go. Yes, David, hello.
Yeah, no, excuse me, I'm a hidden partner.
I know we are, yeah.
It depends okay. on open doors, people
yeah,
rushing in and out. Look, you know, marvelous contribution. Thanks, Aman. Look, we're heading to a situation where we're finding in many developing countries, as throughout Africa, and also in particular, also Asia, we've looked at Sri Lanka and Pakistan, of extreme political instability. largely through the state in something of a collapse. In other words, the national bourgeois takes over the state-owned enterprises, but runs them into the ground. They don't want privatization as we understand it. What they want is appropriation to themselves, to take over the state and to make that their main source of income. And I think, although Iran has many different peculiarities, that's more or less what we see, a moribund national bourgeois determined to act totally independently on the basis of one country, putting forward its aspirations for world prominence and or regional domination, waging wars, and putting the price of all of this activity on the working class. But unfortunately, they are really just the fleas on the back of imperialist dogs, of the larger powers. And so they wriggle here and they wriggle there, and they try to make deals or not make deals or fight for so-called sovereignty to be able to oppress their own people without anyone complaining, and that's what we're up against. And I raise this particularly sharply because of a discussion I was in recently where Ronnie Kasrils, who is a leading spokesman for the South African Communist Party, praised Modi, praised Bolsonaro, and praised Iran for being strongly anti-imperialist. That was the basis. In other words, if you disagree with America on any particular point, you're a hero in the eyes of the Communist Party. There's no mention of the working class. There's no mention of people's struggle for survival against despotic regimes. And yet that's from where we start. We're looking for international solidarity, for supporting the working class. We've seen magnificent struggles in Iran. Unfortunately, often these are not well reported. And so we have to rely very much on you, Aman, to be able to understand what's happening in Iran. And this has enormous implications, particularly for Lebanon, where Hezbollah is part of a conglomerate of the local elites and a national bourgeois there. And they're pushing the idea that Iran can actually save Lebanon from the domination by Israel and by other states. And in turn, Saudi Arabia is then trying to undermine Hezbollah. And so we have a whole series of proxy wars, civil wars, and types of mobilization, which I think Aman put it very well, which lead towards a kind of a situation of mayhem. And where there's mayhem, then the state, whatever the men with guns are, can then impose their order, and people just have to accept it. This is the condition in which the third world, the second world, which is slipping into the third world, is in right now. And I think, the leadoff and some of the contributions have sharpened this up enormously. So we're not anti-imperialist per se. We start from the basis of the working class and its interests nationally and internationally, and that's the basis on which we base our politics. Thanks so much.
Thanks, David. Unless anybody's got any very brief comments now, I'm going to ask Aman if he wants. You've got I don't know, what is it, about 10 or 15 minutes at his disposal if you want to say anything else, Aman. I don't see, and then we'll return to Roger for next week's meeting. Okay.
Thanks a lot, man. I mean, to be very honest with you, the reason why I asked it was not because I disagreed in terms of the commitments, but I wanted just to show you that, or at least wanted to stress the importance of keeping the international solidarity across the world on one hand. Secondly, it's a good wake-up call, because sometimes we get stuck in our own situations in different countries, and it seems that the world is just there, although that is important. But as soon as something happens somewhere else, if you like, a beacon of light happens somewhere, then it shows how much more the urgency of our work, put it this way. If I lived in Egypt, if I lived in New York, or lived in Sydney or London or anywhere else, as soon as you see an uprising or a revolutionary perspective somewhere, especially if it is a red cover, then I think it just brings to front again the importance of doing what we're doing, and obviously the importance of a lot more haste in terms of ensuring that something does take place. And I think that was one issue. The second thing, I wanted to stress the importance of continuation of building international solidarity, no matter how small today, hoping that would be the basis on which we can build much bigger things in the future. And I think that was the second point, which I thought. And last but not least, I personally, I do think that if there is a socialist revolution anywhere, I have little faith, if any, in many of the major institutions that work under the name of workers to come anywhere to the front. And therefore the importance of actually working, as was mentioned absolutely correctly with rank and file, trying to build alternatives that could actually provide something in the future, because the apparatus, whether they're part of the power or they're partially part of the power or hoping to get part of it to the power, or they've been part of the power, the establishment in all its forms and factions would not come to the aid, and therefore the task that we have becomes much stronger. That's it. Thanks very much for listening.
Okay, thanks very much, Aman. Okay, I think that's the end of the discussion. We seem to be talked out for the time being. Can I now turn to Roger about next week's meeting?
Yes, well, obviously, the purpose of our meetings is precisely to develop international solidarity and to focus on the struggle in each country. And that's therefore Aman's question was of particular relevance to us. I'm reminded of a quotation that Marx used to use, I think, a quotation from Napoleon, when he was asked by some of his generals about, what would be the consequences and whether this tactic could succeed and so on. And he would say, first engage, then see. So we have to engage and then see. Now, of all the struggles that are going on in the world, which are, as I said, far too numerous to list, but one of the most acute is that in Sri Lanka, where we have still no government, where we have a complete and utter breakdown of society. To call it a failed state would be an understatement of the situation. But we also have a working class with strong traditions, which recently actually called an indefinite general strike. It's unfortunately that did not materialize for reasons which we hope we can go into in the meeting next week. We have two comrades here now from Sri Lanka. In the
three, actually, Roger, three.
Three, sorry.
Three.
Three, okay. And in the very difficult conditions in which they're operating. Next week, we hope that there'll be a number of comrades from Sri Lanka who will participate and who will explain to us the situation. And all solidarity to the comrades, we can say that now, and we really look forward to learning from the comrades' experience of this struggle. So next week, comrades on Sri Lanka.
Okay, thanks very much, Roger. Okay, so Saranapala waving. Asa Saranapala hopefully will be giving us a report next week. Okay, well, that's the end of the meeting then. I think this has been a really, really interesting and thought-provoking discussion, and quite a piercing discussion, really, about, an example of what's happening in Iran and how that can play out in the rest of the world. So with those final words, thank you all for your attendance, and I declare the meeting closed and hope we'll see you next week. Bye for now.
Bye, comrades.
Thank you.